the One Ring is something that is a massive pressure in the other direction, and we feel, at least for now, opens up a lot of gameplay to see that we kind of want to give it a chance to see if it's problematically strong.
Sure.
If it's strong, it is a really fun thing to be strong, and at the end of the day, something is going to be the strongest, so this is a bet we're comfortable taking, at least in the short term.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You, me, and SpongeBob are equally surprised that at the end of the day, the One Ring managed to dodge the ban hammer. A lot of people wanted it, and with recent polls, one on Twitter from Nikachu and one I did on my YouTube kind of community post section, a lot of you actually thought that the One Ring was worse than Grief. I personally still land on the fact that when it comes to the double Grief side of things, they take away your ability to play the game, whereas the One Ring takes away your ability to close out. It's kind of the exacerbation of the whole top deck scenario, where in a world where your opponent top decks the One Ring, not only does it provide them with 3 cards for the price of 1 life and 4 mana, and the way you come to that is you play it, you tap it for 1 card, then on your next turn, you're going to lose 1 life to the counter you put onto it, then you tap it to draw 2 more cards, and you also gain the protection from everything clause. It essentially is like almost a soft Teferi's protection, but just with like more card draw. You get so much out of the One Ring, and from then on, if you're not able to deal with it, then it's just going to continue to gain that value. The turn after that, you'll draw 3 more cards. You'll have drawn 6 cards for the price of 3 life and 4 mana. That is a pretty damn good exchange, and one that I hope the average Magic player would be more than welcome to do, and I think many have. Based on the intro clip here, it's kind of surprising to hear the reasoning behind not wanting to ban the One Ring. I think there is a case to not want to, but if the reasoning for Grief was that it created bad play patterns, why bother keeping it in the format now? I mean, especially from a price perspective, the card is so expensive. As you see from the thumbnail that I posted for this video, the price has just been slowly creeping up all over again. And I mean, it has been that recent conversation about the fact that we could reprint it. Mark Rosewater did confirm that. I brought that up in a previous video, and it's kind of nice to see that we can do an in-universe version of it as well, but they probably want to milk out as much money as possible from the current printing of the One Ring and just keep its hype up. It also wouldn't probably be a great look from a marketing perspective to have the one of one ring that Post Malone has be removed from the one format it really gets played a lot in, and that really is Modern. It's not seeing a lot of play in Legacy at all. I think there's like some niche play in Vintage, but again, that it could probably be removed from that thought process as well, because Vintage generally just wants to ignore that and be faster than the opponent. So there are only a few limited ways that it can be played. And from a Commander perspective, I personally have 1 copy, and that's all I needed for my Commander play. I just create some proxies and just have the real copy if anyone really wants to fight me on it. And it has that value there. It's a great gamble target. It's a great tutor target. Honestly, it probably is the ultimate tutor target when you really think about it. From a design perspective, we've known for years that colorless cards and artifacts in general have been a very controversial topic, just because of how they break the color pie. They break the design limitations placed on cards by their colors, how you cast them, and how you develop your resources, whereas the One Ring circumvents all of that in so many ways. The One Ring is kind of that quintessential artifact, the card that is ubiquitous, the card that you want in almost all of your strategies, but certain strategies probably just don't have the space for it, or can do more efficient things within their 60 card limitation, I guess, if you want to call it that. Now, the One Ring itself, the ability to give you protection, draw multiple cards is fine by itself, but it also kind of loses some flavor aspects as well, because both sides of the table can have a One Ring, and so that becomes a little bit difficult as well, especially with mechanics like the ring tempts you and all that stuff. But that's more so like a limited thing. It didn't really make its way into Eternal formats. But when it comes to that One Ring, the fact that of course you can only have 1 on your side is fine. It's a legendary artifact, but also just the fact that you can chain together multiple rings is where it gets really interesting. People have brought up the whole case of like restricting the ring and all that, and I'm not really on that boat just yet. I think we can let go of restrictions for formats like Modern. I think it's fine for formats like Timeless and Vintage, where you want to do something a little bit more unique and you want to bring a draw to the format. But of course, when it comes to design and play, Wizards of the Coast have known to be ones to cater to the casual audience, and restrictions are really not casual at all. We know that from a perspective of coming into a format and learning something something new, it can be a lot of onboarding for you, especially as a modern player going to standard, a paper player going to arena. There's a lot of things that you have to learn and absorb, and a restriction is kind of that initial piece that you're like, wait, why is this restricted? I can play a one-of copy. Okay, when I play it, it's not that powerful. Like it's hard for people to really get on board with that. And I think that's why they want to avoid that. Also, when it comes to printing as well, it's nice that if you have some type of like way to identify what is restricted and what isn't, you want to make sure that you're able to do that, again, to welcome the casual audience. So again, that's my little rant about the casual perspective, because you don't want to restrict in that sense. The formats that we have that have restrictions aren't necessarily casual friendly. Timeless is one where if you have a lot of wild cards, if you have a lot of money invested on arena, then you're probably playing Timeless. And if you're playing Vintage, I mean, I don't know. I guess you already got a house and everything, because Lord knows Vintage decks are quite literally down payments on property. But for the One Ring itself, controversies aside in terms of its downside, we know that in EDH that it is probably the single best artifact that you could have in any deck in terms of like putting it in there and immediately knocks your deck up like a power level or two. It's one of those polarizing cards that, especially for those of you that have the One Ring, I highly recommend comment down below. What has been your experience in games when you play the One Ring versus when you don't play the One Ring? Especially in a format with 40 life versus 20, the initial life loss that you get off of it is a lot easier to manage, especially in life gain strategies, than it is in 20 card formats. But in constructed formats, the value you get by chaining multiple rings is what has this price going up so much. And that, I think, is what the scary thing is. The value that you get out of the One Ring decks, which by the way are multiple in the modern format. And I think that's where that kind of discussion around what the ban and restricted announcement and their reasonings for just drove a lot of people kind of to insanity, kind of trying to decipher the reasonings versus banning Grief, which is fine. I'm not saying we shouldn't ban Grief, but also not banning the One Ring, because they didn't feel like there was a ubiquitous kind of one deck that abused the One Ring, which isn't really the best reason, because now it's in every deck. But I'm wondering if they're trying to treat the One Ring like a Ragavan situation, where for so long people have wanted Ragavan to be banned. And I think it's at that point where a lot of people kind of low-key discovered that, like, yeah, Ragavan isn't really the most broken thing in the world. It's just kind of the most powerful threat at one red. And I think that's fine. It's just, even now, if you're playing a red deck, chances are you're probably just playing Ragavan, because it's the best thing that you could be doing on turn one, and it forces your opponent to just like have the removal for it. But that's a lot more difficult with something like the One Ring. But with what I mentioned in terms of design, any deck can play it being colorless. You can gain some amount of value for it, unless you're playing something like Lantern Control and you're trying to get value off of like ensnaring bridges and stuff. You probably don't want to be drawing a million cards a turn, but you're probably running something like Collective Brutality in that as well, just like ways to take advantage of a bunch of cards in your hand. But with every deck being able to play it, it's not like Ragavan, where we can leave Ragavan alone to just be in the red decks. Heck, the super aggressive red decks, like even the burn decks, like they're not playing Ragavan. It's the mid-range and control decks that are generally using that as a threat to leverage some type of value off of. But the One Ring is in everything. You play the One Ring, you draw a bunch of cards, and then once you start losing too much life, you play another One Ring and you chain another one together. I think that's where a lot of people's frustration are. Like, yes, there's a whole comeback mechanic to it, and I think a lot of people feel worse about once they've spent a lot of resources and they're now losing a game based off a card that they don't have and your opponent is coming back from. But what I would argue is that in this case, Grief is worse because it has that hidden value. Like, a lot of people keep saying, like, you can come back from Grief, but you can't come back from the One Ring. I mean, like, you played a whole game. Did you like if the One Ring has been this ubiquitous for this long, isn't a little disingenuous to say that like a lot of people don't like they should be playing Answers to it? And I will argue that I will also kind of follow your argument that it is hard to deal with, that once it does resolve, being indestructible has forced certain targets out of like Urza's Saga to be played more so in the format, just to be able to exile and handle it that way. A lot of people have also said until they find a clear, defined, unifying one mana way to deal with it, then their reason, you know, it's just going to be that universal thing that a lot of decks are playing. And I think that's perfectly fine too. It just feels like, why is a 4 mana indestructible artifact really the card that is taking over everyone's woes? Are we past the point where, you know, cards like Spell Pierce, and Lord knows it's probably not playable anymore, but like Disdainful Stroke is not that relevant anymore. I mean, those are both blue cards, and sure, there are certain cards that aren't able to answer it, but it feels like the circumvention for this effect was really just grief. I mean, Orcish Bowmasters has been quoted as a way to potentially be that answer to the One Ring, but then Orcish Bowmasters is both expensive and inaccessible for a lot of colors, because you obviously need to be playing black, and playing Orcish Bowmasters also means that, well, you need to be able to play to a different style. You're playing a slower game, you're not tapping out, you're playing controlling, like your game plan and the spells you're playing really shift around it, which is why we see decks like Dimir, Frog Tide, and stuff like that really see popularity. The Psychic Frog being the better threat, the Murktide being the good top end, cards to fill, cards to draw, cards to remove, and you play Orcish Bowmasters in there to punish your opponent and maybe like a shield Drit or two for letting them draw a bunch of cards. And that's what like multiple One Rings does. Maybe black is the color that ultimately punishes the One Ring. But if every deck is wanting the One Ring, not every other deck can then play black in response to that. So that's where like my argument kind of falls apart, and I see both sides of it. It's hard because I have that bias of playing mill myself. A lot of my cards and a lot of parts of my strategy circumvent what the One Ring is trying to do. I don't necessarily care that you're drawing more cards, because that's less cards for me to mill. I have cards like Fractured Sanity and Tasha's Hideous Laughter and Ruin Crab that get around effects like this. And generally speaking, I have cards like Visions of Beyond that can almost equate to the value that the One Ring is providing you. Heck, I even want to play the One Ring in my mill list itself, but what does that mean for the One Ring? Because when it comes to accessibility, which is the last point I want to bring up here, it's become problematic because right now on face-to-face games, and I shouldn't call this like a be-all end-all a price, I'm just quoting this as a Canadian, but the price of the One Ring is somewhere between $190 to $200 for a base cost One Ring. So for a playset, you're paying approximately $800. Now, if you were to play Jeskai Control, a Force of Negation is somewhere between $60 to $80. Now, if you were to pay $80 for a playset of Force of Negation, that is, you know, 80, 160, two of them, 300 and $320. Sorry, 80, I said that's not 160. 80 is 190. That is $300 plus for that. At that point, like, you're paying over $1,000 for 8 cards. At this point, we are approaching like old legacy prices on decks that are playable in modern, specifically because of the One Ring. And whereas in legacy, you have multiple cards that might be more valuable, but now more so it's that legacy cards are kind of dominated by really powerful recent cards, but the mana base is really what tends to be the most expensive part of many decks these days. It kind of feels like that's where modern is edging to. No, we're not gooning ourselves into a crazy price loophole here. The finance bros aren't taking over with their edge sessions. We are finding our way to a place where certain key staples in the modern format are taking us to a price point inaccessible for everyone. Because if the One Ring is ubiquitous, if the One Ring is played by everybody, if it is a value engine that everyone wants to abuse, and it's one that now, as of the announcement of the banned and restricted announcement, that if they're going to stay to it, we can now abuse the One Ring for free until December 16, 2024, because we see their hesitancy to ban something like this. We see their hesitancy to answer anything like this. So until December 16th, which is the next banned and restricted announcement, we won't see a change. We'll see the whole RCQ season play out to probably One Ring decks that can play the One Ring decks, and like Psychic Frog decks. That's probably what it's going to end up being. So if that is where it's going to be, what is our way to answer the One Ring? Because the price is inaccessible. We are again approaching, as I was mentioning, and I didn't really finish my point, the point where modern decks are now all going to be soft old legacy decks where you have to pay at least $1,000 for your base. And then after that, you are then putting in whatever shell you want to throw it into, Tron, mid-range control, whatever it might be. You are probably having to play the One Ring or other expensive pieces that efficiently deal with the One Ring in that sense. So is that what modern is? It's One Ring tribal, it's One Ring the format. And I'm really curious as to like where the modern format needs to be. I'm wondering if there is an answer to the One Ring that everyone is ignoring, or the meta just needs to evolve where people don't need to just play the One Ring, they need to play other decks that beat the One Ring better. Are people just stubborn and they want to play the archetypes they want? Because the metagame ultimately is just a reflection of what people want to play. It may not necessarily be a reflection of what are the best decks, because we've seen in multiple metagames decks that I would argue are really bad in that metagame. They are just fan favorites and they may in a niche way beat up on a certain deck, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good strategy. All the other decks in the metagame might beat up on that strategy, but just because it's able to maybe have like a decent matchup against the best deck, it just becomes like an odds game where if you go to an RCQ, if you go to a tournament, chances are you're going to be seeing this deck in a high percentage, so you might have a high percentage chance in that. So you're metagaming in that sense. But is there a way to do that with the One Ring? I don't think so yet. I mean, I was going to say I don't think so, but then I was like, I don't think there is just yet, which I think where the problem is and where the problem lies with the One Ring. I think there's both sides of the story, and I kind of see where the problem is ultimately. And I feel like it probably should be banned, but for now, you should abuse it. I think there is a correct way to play Modern at this point. It is kind of solved in that way. You should probably be playing a mid-ranger control list with the One Ring. And I mean, all these conversations aside about how, you know, Titan has been the most busted deck in the format, and the only thing that's been holding it back is people's ability to pilot it and the difficulty of the deck. That's also like a One Ring deck. And so we see multiple strategies throughout Modern's history, Tron as well, mid-range and everything, that have evolved to play the One Ring. Maybe it's just all of our jobs to play the One Ring, but that's not great, because as I was mentioning with our Ragavan point, Ragavan is just the red card. It is fine in that archetype. Heck, even red and 6 isn't that much of a problem anymore. But if the One Ring is gone, do some of these old things rear its head? As Carmen was mentioning in the beginning clip, is it just that the One Ring, honestly, at the end of the day, is a fun thing to be powerful, and we're not adapting? I don't know if I follow that logic, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts down below. What do you think about everything I had to say? What do you think about the One Ring? Where do you stand with the One Ring in Modern? I mean, for the sake of Commander, it's fine. You know, the format can self-regulate itself, and you can ban the One Ring out. And I think generally, if you're playing the One Ring, the power of your deck probably increases like kind of 2 to 3 fold. But in this sense, what is the point of the One Ring in Modern if the point of banning Grief was play patterns, but the One Ring is leading to bad play patterns as well?